So I find it fascinating that you guys took that risk and ended up enabling others. So I'm curious, when you look at other watch companies.
Wait, Asher, hold on a second. Are you saying that Marco didn't just design a watch, he started a movement?
Oh, I like, well, there's a good double entendre there. Nice.
Yeah, put that in the case study video.
Yeah, there's your cold open. Anyway.
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Apkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Singer Reimagined, Zeitwinkel, Archanaut, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Today, we're going behind the scenes of watch design with Marco Borraccino, the co-founder, CEO, and creative director of Singer Reimagined. In addition to starting one of the most design-driven watch brands, Marco was previously head of design at Panerai. He's got a deep educational and career background in design, both within the watch industry and beyond. And he's among the most talented and distinctive watch designers out there. Finally, in full transparency, Collective is an authorized retailer of Singer Reimagined. And with that out of the way, Marco, welcome to Open Work.
Hi, guys. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today.
Why don't we start with your background? You started as a designer outside of the watch industry, and you trained formally as a designer. So I think it would be interesting to start with your perspective and your experience as a designer beyond watches, because I think that will help lend some contrast to what's unique about designing watches in particular. So why don't we start? Tell us a little bit about your education and career background in design before you moved into watches.
I was born and raised in Milan. Milan is a very well known place for design in the furniture industry mainly, and I grew up in a family that was very much artistic. My grandpa was a painter, and he used to be somebody that was, today we could define a geek. He used to collect every kind of new thing that was coming on the market. Back in time, we are talking about more than 50 years ago. They, telephones, TV screen, radio, all typing machine, they became very colorful because of the use of plastic, because of the interaction with, a new way of living. My grandpa used to buy all this stuff because he was attracted by this thing. So as a very young kid, I used to see this very colorful and disparate object around this place. And I always been attracted by objects. On the other hand, my daddy, he used to work in the car industry. So the other passion I was grown with was cars. And when I grew up, I decided I wanted to become a designer for cars because that was my main passion. So I got to study industrial design in Milan with the aim of becoming a car designer, and very quickly understood that designing a car is not that as much fun as somebody could imagine, because very often you are confined to design just a detail of the car. It's very difficult that a designer can take in charge the whole thing. So I understand that there were a lot of other items that deserve to be designed. And so I started exploring. I've been designing mobile phones, I've been designing packaging, furniture, of course, a lot of things. And by chance, my first real job was with an Italian company manufacturing watches for third parties, for other brands. And I was hired as their main designer when I get out of the university. And it was very, very interesting time because we were designing for brand in the, let's say, entry-level market. But I was designing possibly 3-4 watches a week. So it was like very quick pace, very intensive. And what was interesting is that you needed to adapt your design to the brand identity. And doing this exercise and repeating this exercise so many times in very short time allowed me to being able to understand how to interpret the brand identity, the brand philosophy very quickly. I think this is one of the strengths I have today, the possibility and the capacity of really creating an identity and sticking to it in order to create a frame that allowed myself and allowed the brand to explore several iterations, because the identity of the brand is a limit in a certain way, but is also the playground you need to deal with. And without this playground, you won't be able to be creative, because if you have no limits, you can do everything, but you actually can do nothing because you have no constraints. So this word constraints is very important when you're discussing about any kind of design, and even more with watches, because we are talking about a very limited surface, a very limited space of expression. And on top of that, we have the ergonomics of the product itself. So it has to be wearable, it has to be readable. So designing a watch is possibly one of the most complicated exercise a designer could face. Even though designing a car is very challenging, the watch and car shares a lot of common things.
One thing that sticks with me from what you're describing is something that we hear from independent watch, both collectors and independent watch makers in general, which is this feeling that today, when somebody goes, say, to watchmaking school, the general job that they get when they come out is, essentially an assembly line, and as a result, so much potential creativity is limited because somebody is being trained almost more like a mechanic than they are being trained as an artist. And hearing what you're describing, one thing that's fascinating is, like, early in your career, you had that opportunity to think more holistically about how a product would come to life. And as you said, how it would represent the brand you were designing for. So few people these days, whether it's in watches or in, former life I was in tech, for example, have that opportunity to look at the holistic perspective. So I wonder, and I know this is tough to think in hypotheticals, but when you talk to young designers, or you talk to people who have an idea for a watch, what do you encourage them to do? Like, for example, for us, when I used to work, at say Facebook or Apple or what have you, I would often have somebody graduating from college and saying, I want a job at Facebook. And my advice was not to do it, because an entry-level job there wouldn't really teach you much. You just do some very small piece of something, whereas the opportunity you had was very different. So what would you say to somebody who's just graduating from design school or Vostep or, something to that effect, who is curious about watchmaking or watch design? Where would you point them?
They are two very different things, because somebody attending a watchmaking school aims to be able to build a watch movement. So that's something that has not that much in common with designing the watch itself. I mean, the two things are related very strictly. A designer needs to understand the watchmaker, and the watchmaker needs to understand the designer. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why, maybe this is something you don't know about my career. When I moved to Geneva from Milan, I got in touch with the design university downtown Geneva. I was asked to provide industrial design course teaching there. And after 1 year of collaboration, I realized that in Switzerland, there was no watch design teaching at university level at all.
Anywhere.
That explains a lot.
Yeah.
There were very, spread around courses in few schools, but there was not a dedicated watch design teaching at all. So in 2012, I sat with the director of the school, and we decided to raise funds and create the very first watch design teaching course at bachelor and master level in Switzerland. This thing came to life in 2014, if I'm not wrong, and is still operating now. I left when I started with the Singer project, but we were the very first to create this course that was actually merging the watchmaking culture of creating and crafting movement and watches with the industrial design culture of creating things with a meaning and with a thought behind. And it's still quite successful teaching today. Is provided to a limited amount of students because there is not that much need on the market. So we don't want to make just unemployed people around. But it's important to underline the fact that if you want to, whatever you want to design, the method and the methodology you applied has to be coherent with the product that you are dealing with.
I find that, honestly, I'm blown away that there wasn't a curriculum to that effect, because one thing that we sometimes find when we are talking to independent watchmakers who are young in their career, who are excited about getting in the business, is that they struggle, to your point, with design. And I'm thinking in particular of one very talented young man who I met recently who showed me his school watch. And it was very clear, as you pointed out, that the focus for him was on the design of that movement, the finishing of the movement, and the execution of that work. But he was very shy, in fact, almost embarrassed of the dial of the watch, because, or in fact, I should say everything, because in his mind, everything else was kind of just the thing holding the movement. And the rest of the watch was essentially an afterthought. And it makes me wonder, nobody's good at everything, right? So the idea that there's the rare genius who's a good watch designer and a good watch maker, but I have to imagine that that's relatively rare. So how do you find that watchmakers traditionally find their way to a designer? Or is there a feeling that they don't need that and that the watch's technical ability just should stand on its own?
This reminds me a lot of our experience working at Facebook early on, which was a very engineering-driven culture. And there was an aversion to basically any trade or any skill outside of software engineering. And design in particular was deemed unnecessary, deemed like window dressing, something that makes things look pretty but doesn't actually provide any true benefit or improvement to the user experience or improvement just to the product fundamentally. And over time, I slowly saw that change, but it was very difficult. I think a lot of these trades where there is an engineering or a craft focus, a lot of times they're sort of allergic to design. So it'd be really interesting. Like, yeah, what is it like walking into the watch industry in Switzerland? Because you mentioned you moved to Geneva. You did end up working at Panerai as head of design. You've started your own watch brand. What has it been like navigating the watch industry as a designer? Is it hard to open the eyes of watchmakers, or is it something that,
or is it a revelation to them?
Is it a revelation to them? I'm curious, because I too have seen these industries where people sort of roll their eyes at design.
Let's say that there are brands that understood this very long time ago. They start collaborating with designers since ages, and that are the brands that are very successful today, and they used to be very successful, even though we have some recent example of some self-designed watch that is.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
What could you possibly be talking about?
The issue with some watchmakers is that, as you said, they are so much focused on the engineering part that they don't give that much about the aesthetic. It is the issue today. If I look at some, let's say, independent watchmakers, they have incredible ideas, very crazy movement, very sophisticated ones, but they are not appealing to a larger public because of the aesthetic of it. So, but possibly these guys will not ask for the help of anybody else because of their own, let's say, ego. But watch designer are, let's say, they are artists in the sense that they are able to create things that appeal to people, but that has a artistic side when you working with materials, when you're working with craftsmen. The idea is to be able to understand the universe around the watch, what is possible, what is not possible, and the magic happens when you are able to come with some idea that are new, that are fresh, and that bring something else on the table that has not been done before. That's why on the Singer brand, whenever we create a new piece, even though it is remindful of something vintage, because that's the inspiration where the brand come from, we always try to bring something that is unique and is unknown, has never been done before. That's my philosophy. It's not the philosophy of everyone, of course, but it's really important for any brand to be appealing, and you can do that through the aesthetic of your product.
So I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of Panerai, because one thing that I've always found intriguing about Panerai is that it's similar to another brand that I like, IWC. The design language, the aesthetic of the watch, it's very deep, but it's very narrow. And there are at least to my eyes, there are very strict rules about what a Panerai is and how a Panerai can come to life. Now, we can debate whether or not that should be the case, whether brands like that should feel more comfortable stepping outside of their traditional design language. But I'm curious to look at Panerai and Singer as two parallel businesses, one with a very well-defined and many-decade-old aesthetic, and one that it was born anew, obviously with clear reference points, but much more room to play. And I'm curious, when you look at a brand like Pan, when you worked there, did that constraint push you creatively in any way? And then when you look at a brand like Singer now, where you have far fewer constraints, what challenges does that present you from a creative standpoint? What's the difference between designing for those types of businesses?
Well, that's a question, because Panerai for me was a very important school of life, in the sense that I understood even further how constraints are important. Unfortunately, I have to say, Panerai wasn't able to develop new languages that would allow them to move into other fields. The Panerai language is very tight, is very strong, is the strength and the limit of Panerai.
Did you try?
I did when I was there. I was in charge of several projects. The former CEO, Mr. Bonatti, that I respect and appreciate a lot, was really the guardian of the DNA of Panerai, and I think he did an amazing job. Unfortunately, when you have a brand, my opinion is that you need to be able to evolve as well. That's something that didn't really happen with Panerai.
Not to dwell there, but I find this fascinating. When you would propose creative risk, and I'm defining that as stepping outside of some of the strict rules of what a watch like that is, where would that die? Like, at what point? Like, would that die in design? Would that die corporately? Like, where was the pressure back against it?
It would die either at the higher level committees, so the group committees where product are
like
decided.
at a Richemont level kind of thing. Interesting.
But most of the time would die in in the discussion between the design department and the CEO.
Was that driven by a desire to protect the brand or fear, or like what do you think that was?
The two of them.
Both of them.
Because as we were saying before, when you propose something new, you take a risk.
Yeah.
So if you're doing well your homeworks, maybe the risk is mitigated. If you don't, the risk can be very high. But the thing is that when you receive such an important, let's say, background, an important language that is the Panerai language, that is very, very strong and very, very stiff, to move away or to move on side of that means a huge risk. Back in time when I was in Panerai, I was 2000, 2008, 2009 until 2009. Panerai was doing very well with everything, so there was no reason to do something different.
And now you work at your own company. You have certainly far fewer constraints than you do, not to be presumptuous, but I assume than you did at Panerai. You have different constraints, I should say.
Yeah.
So now here you are, maybe you have a different set of resources or lack thereof compared to working for a giant company. You started with a blank piece of paper, and I'm curious, now you're in a position of defining a design language for a brand. So can you talk a little bit about that? What, you stepped into one, you leave one job where you have, strict brand guidelines, very clear aesthetic, and then you step into a new job, essentially, where you are defining all of that from scratch. Where do you start?
Let's say that in the meanwhile, between Panerai and Singer, there were 10 years of experience and collaboration with several other brands that teach me a lot of things as well. Starting up a new brand from scratch, as we did, means to define your own limits and to define your own language, your own constraints. That's very important, because you need to be coherent if you want to build a brand identity, a brand DNA, and that's what we've been trying to do since 2017, to create codes and languages that are understandable and understood by our potential clients. So the temptation was great to do smaller, bigger, higher, thinner, whatever. But the thing is that if you start not being coherent in the very beginning, you won't be coherent ever. So you need to build strong element of your brand language and use them as much as possible, and to reiterate them and to repeat them and to keep proposing them in order for them to become part and to become the expression of the brand. The last example is the dive watch that we release is by far the possibly the biggest stretch we could have done.
Huge departure. Yeah.
And still, when you look at the watch,
it's a Singer.
It's a Singer. Because we've been able to use codes and elements that are common to the rest of the collection, even though we push them very far away. And even though a diving watch was something that nobody would expect from Singer. But the thing is, the philosophy that is behind this watch is exactly the same that you find on our very first chronograph. We are pushing boundaries. We are making things that nobody else dared to do before.
So for those who haven't seen this watch, I'd encourage you to check it out, the Singer Dive Track. In fact, we did an in-depth video and article on this watch where we get into this watch, which is one of the most creative, if not, it's the most creative reconceiving of a dive watch I've ever seen. I think, Asher, you'd probably agree with that. He's actually looking at the watch now, so he can't comment.
I'm wearing one right now. We never do wrist checks on this pod, but just for giggles. I have the pleasure of wearing this for this hour.
You've broken the biggest rule of this podcast, the only rule of this podcast. check this watch out. And I think if you look at this watch and you check out our video, we explain how this relates to Singer's other watches and chronographs and their approach to the chronograph in general. And you'll see exactly what Marco is talking about. Now, we've talked a lot about constraints. We've talked about the constraint of a brand. We've talked about the constraints of watchmaking, whether those are technical or constraints of the laws of physics, or constraints by the perceptions, biases, and attitudes of watchmakers themselves. Let's talk a little bit about opportunities, and the dive track is a good example of this. One of the coolest things about the dive track is really the central case, the mid case of that watch is sapphire, and the outside of the case is really it's titanium, but it's an exoskeleton to protect that sapphire ring at the center of the watch. Now, I'm sure that manufacturing with sapphire has come a long way since you started your career in watches. So that kind of case construction is a possibility that's available to you now that wasn't when you started designing watches. How has watchmaking, technology, material science opened up new possibilities for you as a designer? And I think the question would be like, how do you make sure as a designer you're constantly evolving with what's technically possible and not just staying in the same path and designing around the same constraints, but designing around new constraints and new possibilities?
Let's say that as a designer, I love to explore new tech and new opportunities. As you said, the dive track is a good example of that. It's by far not I would say, the most extreme technology we can use today. We are experimenting things that are even crazier than that. The thing is that you need to make them reliable. So the big gap is between the idea and the possibility to make that idea real and then to make it reliable. That's a long way. The dive track is a lab watch, I would say. We've been testing construction of this watch for 5 years. We've been really going through different materials. We've been going through different sealings. I mean, everything was tried to get to the perfect solution up to today. And in the same time, we've been exploring other stuff. And 3D printing today, for example, is opening up a lot of opportunity. I've been dealing with 3D printing since ever, I would say. We were possibly the very first back in 1999 to offer 3D printed prototype watches to brands back in my previous life. So that's a technology that today offer a lot of opportunities. Then the milling technology as well has evolved a lot. We can grow metal. We can literally grow metal from scratch. We can do things that are incredible today. The thing is, at the end, what really bring the most value of what you're handling is the final human touch, and that's where I think I'm very, very conservative, because whatever you use as a production technology, the final touch of the guy or the girl making the right polishing at the right place is where the big value of your product really shine.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word designer, they imagine someone sitting like at a computer with like two monitors and like a stylus, designing something, or a sketchbook. But a big part of being a designer, especially in the watch industry, from what I've learned working with watch designers, is getting into the field. So for instance, we are working on a project now where we provoked a watch brand we're working with around using sapphire for a component they don't usually use sapphire for. And the question to them and to their designer in particular was, would this be possible? Could we use sapphire here? And I expected like the watchmakers on the team would weigh in with a response. And it was the designer in the product development meeting who stepped up and said, I don't know. I'd like to try doing this. I'm going to get on an airplane. I'm going to go to a trade show, and I am going to meet with as many sapphire suppliers as I possibly can. And I'm going to go find this out. And he got on a plane. Actually, the trade show he was going to was in Geneva, of all places. And he met with a bunch of suppliers, got some samples, is working on drawings and prototypes around this. But it was sort of shocking to me to think like, oh, the designer's not just the guy sitting at the computer, like designing a watch dial. He's the one going into the field to actually see if this is feasibly possible. And it sort of challenged what I had as a preconceived notion about what watch designers do and how they work. And to your point, the importance of getting hands-on.
So this brings up a really interesting question for me. While we were talking here, I switched watches. But of course, one thing that's consistent across every watch that you make is that every movement is made by Agenor. So I'm curious, given this conversation we were just talking about, which came first, the chicken or the egg, Agenor or the design? And we talked, going back to the constraint of technicality prior, usually like when we talk to independent watchmakers, the design falls out of the complication that they're building or the movement that they've made. In this instance, I'm curious, did you start knowing that you had, say, access to an Agengraph movement, and then you designed around it, or was it the other way around?
That's a very interesting question, because that's the genesis of Singer itself. So I was designing the central chronograph after a meeting with my partner in crime, that is Rob Dickinson. And the idea was to have the chronograph as the main actor with a wristwatch. So I designed this specific model, the Trek one, before knowing the Agengraph was existing. Also because the Agengraph was not existing at all at that point.
Was there any movement that could do what you wanted it to do?
There was no movement able to do what I was willing to do. I knew that was possible because technically I knew I understand watchmaking and I knew it was possible, but there was no watchmaker offering such a movement in Switzerland and anywhere. So I started knocking a few doors around, and nobody wanted to even start talking about developing a new chronograph, because it's by far the most complicated things you can imagine to do in the watchmaking field.
There's a reason why most chronographs, in one way or another, are based on old designs.
Absolutely. Nobody did a new chronograph for the last 50 years and more, because to make a new chronograph is freaking complicated. And so I came with this idea. I was struggling to get somebody interested into the idea of creating a central chronograph. And thanks to the collaboration I was having with the Design University, I set up a scientific committee inviting personalities from the watchmaking field. Among them, there was Jean-Marc Wiederrecht. Mm-hmm. And one day we had a lunch together, and we were discussing our lives. And he was asking me what I was doing beyond teaching, because we didn't know each other very well. And I told him that I was on a few projects, and one of them was with a California car maker. And we say, well, what is this shit? I mean, who would buy a watch from a California car maker? And accidentally, I showed him my idea to have his opinion. And he almost fell down from the chair, because he realized that I was designing something that was matching an idea that he had on his own side.
But he was thinking about it purely from an engineering standpoint, yeah?
He was thinking about the central chronograph since his watchmaking school times, because he considered that the chronograph was not efficient enough in terms of readability. Mm. That was exactly the same starting point I took on the design perspective when I started designing it. And when I showed him the design of the Trek one, he couldn't understand that somebody else would have the same idea as he had. So a few days after we met and we sat together, I brought my design. He brought his drawing of the movement. At that point, there was nothing, really, literally nothing. And we understood that we could have done something together at the very precise point, because my idea and this engineering idea were really completely matching. It was like star aligning. And it was crazy, honestly speaking. It was just incredible. So we decided to invest into development of the Agent Graph. Rob flew to Geneva to meet Jean-Marc. And we shaked our hand and we started working on that.
Was Agenor a thing yet? Did that company exist at this time?
Yeah. They've been existing for the last 20 plus 25 years.
Got it. Okay. So forgive my ignorance on that, but the Agent Graph itself, because in my mind, like when I think of Agenor at
they're
this point,
synonymous. Yeah.
exactly. But
they've done some really bonkers movements for other folks.
So Fabergé and
yeah. Well, I love the Fiona Kruger, is it the Chaos collection?
Yes, of course, right.
She has got an Agenor movement with just the most insane bridge architecture. And the movement is a complete thought because it's conceived. The movement is both the dial and the caseback.
Yeah.
It's wild. So Agenor is just incredibly talented.
Well, that's actually a great point coming back to you, because the Fiona Kruger watch that you're talking about, that is, by the way, if anyone listening is unfamiliar, go to Fiona's website and check it out. But Fiona, of course, another watch designer, very different aesthetic, very different approach.
Yeah,
but
designer.
Yes, but what I find interesting about what you guys are talking about here is both of those projects, even though they couldn't be more different, are in alignment of a complete idea that is driven by aesthetics and a concept, backed up by a technical approach that meets it. It's not
a lot of design-driven watches typically leave, and there's so many exceptions to what I'm about to say. Please don't lampoon me. But generally speaking, when you think about a design-driven watch, a lot of times the watchmaking aspect of it or the movement aspect of it is an afterthought,
mm-hmm.
or generally made from something that's kind of a commodity, movement, which is, we've did a whole episode on movements. We don't need to go there, but you're right. What's very unusual about these guys with Marco and Fiona is like the movement side of the watch is a complete thought and part of the design and leaves nothing to be desired from a watchmaking and finishing standpoint.
You also mentioned something which, we talk a lot about on this podcast, and as fellow business owners we see as well, which is in order to achieve what it is that you want to accomplish, there are all different kinds of risk. There's creative risk, and there's of course financial and professional risk. And you mentioned a moment ago that you and your partner invested essentially to create this movement. I don't know what that worked out to financially, but I have to imagine that was a not insignificant risk. And what's interesting to me about that is not only did that give birth to what's on my wrist right now, to a Track 1, it also enabled a number of other watchmakers who now use Agent Graph movements to be able to create something that also follows through on what you were thinking about from a design standpoint, the power of a central, like a more easy to read, centrally mounted chronograph that essentially inverts the dominance of the watch, which is a really interesting design, because to me, like one of the things that really defines a Singer, aside from how you approach each traditional trope, whether it's an automotive chronograph or a dive watch, is also this inversion of the not just the priority, but also the overall design of the watch, right? I mean, to your point, it's kind of ridiculous that for 100 years, we've all had to like squint to be able to determine the key complication of...
Yeah, the reason you bought the watch.
Exactly.
Ostensibly.
To be able to have a stopwatch on your wrist, but in the meantime, I already wear bifocals and you need it anyway. A Singer inverts that, which is fascinating because you'd imagine, if we go back to this whole point about engineering versus design, that's a design problem. Like, that's a conceptually driven problem, but nobody chose to solve it because they were being hindered by an engineering issue. It's not that there isn't enough money in Switzerland to figure out how to do this. There's plenty. There just clearly wasn't the will. So I find it fascinating that you guys took that risk and ended up enabling others. So when you look at other watchmakers that are currently using an Agengraph movement, I'm curious, like, how does that make you feel? Because I have an opinion on that, and I'm curious for you.
That's a good question.
Mm-hmm. I would say is on one side is rewarding because you understand that what you have done is as a meaning, as a sense. On the other side, if it would have been a big group, we could have just kept the movement for us and make it an exclusive thing. But life is life, so we are happy to share this technology, and this was the purpose actually since the very beginning. We were not able to invest enough money to keep it just for ourselves, so we allowed Jean-Marc and Agenor to offer the same architecture of the movement to other brands at the condition they would invest as much as we did.
Ah, interesting.
And the second condition was to develop a different display compared to ours. So we kept our own versions of the Agengraph for us, and the other brands were allowed to use the same architecture by developing their own, let's say, complication.
So the time display, not the chronograph display, is different across those different.
Also, the chronograph display is different because we are actually carrying the most complicated version of the Agengraph. We have the 60-hour central chronograph, and we have the 24-hour central chronograph, both of them with peripheral time hours and a minute indication.
Right.
Other version of the chronograph on the market today, they are way simpler with only central hands, so without peripheral indication, and without the hour stage of the chronograph. That is the most complicated to achieve.
I see. Yeah, so the Moser Streamliner would be like an example of that. Got it.
So we've explored a lot here, and before we wrap up, there's one other thing that I think is really fascinating about the way that you've approached the business. And granted, this is the way I see it. So if you don't see it this way, please tell me. When I look at the lines that you've developed, and I'm going to focus on three, right? When we look at Dive Track, Track 1, and the 1969 collection. With those three collections, you've looked at essentially tropes from the design from the watch world that are very well worn roads: automotive chronographs, sports watches, dive watches. Yeah, these are all things that, I mean, there are countless examples in all those categories of watches. But the thing that I think attracted both Gabe and I to Singer as just watch collectors and fans, but also just from a business standpoint as retailers, was how each of those lines is a complete reinvention and inversion of what somebody might think of when they think of a dive watch, or what they think of when they think of an automotive chronograph. When you say that out loud, it sounds kind of easy. You know, it's like, well, I'm just going to start from scratch. But of course, the reason that those roads are so well worn is because people probably try to solve a problem and they end up at the same place, I suspect, because that's the most traditional way to solve that problem. So just by way of example, if you could pick one of those lines and just walk us through when you said, I'm going, maybe exclude Track 1 since that was the original one, but if we look at 1969 or Dive Track, when you sat down and made the decision that you were going to make a diver or you were going to make a sports watch, what were the questions that you asked yourself to set yourself on that path to be able to land on something that was unexpected?
Let's say that, first of all of these watches, all of them, they come from the passion that I have for each of this category. So I love diving watches. I love sport watches, chronograph from the 60s and the 70s. It's something that obsessed me in a way. So that's an easy playground when you are used to the element and the codes of these watches, for me at least. But the thing is that all of our watches are purpose driven. The idea behind the dive watch, for example, came the day after I designed the track one back in 2015. The thing is that it needed time to be mature enough and to solve the issues that we faced, because I wanted to be a real statement. And to do that, you need to find a way and to ask you the right questions. So why all diving watches are the same? Because nobody thought about diving watches ever. That's the answer. They just one guy one day put up turning bezel on a 3-hand watch, and it works for diving. That's fine.
Well, they made it waterproof too.
Okay, and a screw down crown. Perfect. And nobody else give a fuck about doing it.
The moon watch is a moon watch.
Yeah, it just happened to go to the moon.
Someone sent it to the moon.
Come on. What I wanted to do was a real tool watch. And I'm not a professional diver. I used to dive a few times, but I get into diving. I've been studying diving in order to understand what is needed and how it works and how you calculate things in order to get the sparkle at some point and say, okay, we can do that this way thanks to our central chronograph, because we can calculate 24 hours, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, and whatever. And then you come out with the design ideas. I have probably tons of sketches and drawings, whatever, of the dial of this watch, because we went through like moon phase like indication, hidden things that happen here and there. And in the end, we came out with something that had to be readable, practical, useful. The thing is that you can do that only because we have developed a central chronograph. So it's a very cyclic thing. And design process is cycles. So you do something, you dismantle it because it doesn't work, and you keep doing it. And at the end, you arrive to something that possibly works. 99% of times it doesn't. And that 1% sometimes makes some nice stuff.
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to leave things. Marco, thank you so much. This is one of the most enlightening conversations we've had. And I meant what I said at the beginning. You are a singular sensation in the world of watch design and incredibly talented. And your watches are incredibly thought-provoking themselves. So thank you for what you do. And thank you for listening to Open Work. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can learn more about our guest, Marco Borraccino, at singerreimagined.com. And of course, you can get in touch with us at collectivehorology.com. Don't forget to send your questions, your feedback, and suggestions to podcast@collectivehorology.com.